Buffalo in the spring of 1836 was a city floating on a sea of optimism. For within a little over a decade, she had, as if by magic, transformed herself from a frontier village to a modern city. New brick buildings lined Main Street. Each year saw larger and more elegant steamboats in our harbor, and the Erie Canal brought an ever-increasing flood of immigrants to Buffalo's doorstep. A golden cascade of grain from western farms began filling her warehouses. Thus wealth poured in from both the east and from the west. Land speculation sent property values skyward as paper fortunes were created in a real estate bubble. Great expectations were in the air. You could breathe deep and believe all was possible. So began the year 1836, in total optimism. But it would not last. If Buffalo was transformed by magic, then Benjamin Rathbun was the wizard. Rathbun was a far-sighted entrepreneur, yet his beginning was humble. With hardly a penny to his name, he leased the Eagle Tavern on Main Street in 1819. And with astute business sense, he prospered and turned one success into many. He became a builder and erected most of the brick buildings in the city. He operated stagecoach lines, canal boat lines, streetcars, factories, stone quarries, banks, stores, hotels, in one vast enterprise. He was a formidable man. Buffalo Harbor was in transition. Brick warehouses, 4 and 5 stories high, were replacing the wood frame structures of the 1820s. Steamboats lined the waterfront, and boats such as the Ohio left port with their decks laden with immigrants. The Ohio was built in 1830 and was the first steamboat on the lake with a full-length upper deck. Now, each year brought larger boats such as the Thomas Jefferson or the Daniel Webster to compete for the lake trade. Commercial Slip, just behind the Ohio, is where the Erie Canal meets the Great Lakes. Even in 1836, there was a traffic jam as canal boats waited to be unloaded. The wood warehouses on the lower Buffalo River would remain much the same through the next decade. The steamboat Ohio is passing the steamboat Michigan. The Michigan was built in Detroit in 1833 and was one of the new generation of large steamboats. The bottom of the scene shows the old Buffalo Lighthouse, built in 1818 and already obsolete. At the end of the breakwall stands the new lighthouse. Constructed in 1833, it still greets modern-day visitors to the harbor. On the right, waiting for a favorable wind, is a 3-masted ship, Julia Palmer. In 1825, the Erie Canal reached Buffalo. From New York City on the Hudson River to Buffalo Harbor on Lake Erie, the water highway now led to the Great Lakes and to the interior of the country. By avoiding the primitive roads of New York State, the Erie Canal cut the cost of shipping from New York City to Buffalo from $100 a ton to $4 a ton. Westward trade soon turned from a trickle into a torrent. With traffic flowed money, and Buffalo became wealthy. The harbor grew, new ships were built, and business prospects were boundless. By 1836, the Erie Canal in Buffalo was branching into a Venice-like system of secondary canals. The original Little Buffalo Creek was dredged for barge traffic. To Commercial Slip was added Thompson's Cut, Washington Street Canal, and Clark and Skinner Canal. The canal was straddled with numerous bridges, such as those at Washington and Main Street. The increased traffic of freight barges saw a building frenzy of warehouses. Passenger barges brought thousands seeking accommodations while waiting for steamboats to the west. Hotels and boarding houses such as Huff's and Temperance House were at full capacity, and as eyewitnesses tell, of baggage and trunks piled high in the streets. The canal lock at Erie Street was the gateway to Buffalo Harbor. At this time, the area around Canal Street was a desired residential neighborhood. However, by the 1850s, these streets would be notorious for crime and villainy. The Buffalo and Niagara Railroad was another Rathbun project. Starting in 1835, Rathbun built the roadbed, bridges, and cars for the train. From Black Rock, the railroad ran alongside the canal until turning up Court Street to the lower terrace, which it followed to its terminus at Pearl Street. For Buffalonians, the railroad was a source of great pride. Its presence was proof that the city was as modern as anything back east. The train arrived and departed from in front of the United States Hotel, which was ideally located for both barge and rail. The Triangle building is the Niagara Hotel, which also housed a theater, and just above it is the Market House. All of these buildings were built by Rathbun. The lower levels of the Market House was dedicated to a public market, while the second floor was the City of Buffalo's council chamber. On the roof was a bell for calling the citizens to fires. The cluster of wood buildings was noted for stores which offered bargain price goods. The building on the corner of Main and Terrace was the Sidway Block, while on the opposite corner is the garden of the French philanthropist Louis Lacouture. At the end of the terrace is the Mansion House, one of Buffalo's finest hotels and a landmark through many decades to come. In the 1830s, the terrace formed a steep slope at Main Street. In winter, it was known for good sledding by the children of the town. However, years of street grading have reduced the slope so that today it's hard to see any evidence of it at all. Churches such as St. Paul's Episcopal, known at the time as Old Blue, and the Old First Presbyterian, were the first large churches in the city. They were located at the confluence of Main, Church, Niagara, and Erie Streets. The empty block is the site for Rathbun's Buffalo Exchange Building. The Exchange Building epitomized the unquenchable optimism in Buffalo at this time. The Exchange Building, when completed, would have occupied the whole block and have dominated the Buffalo skyline for years to come. Her dome would have risen 222 feet above the ground. To grasp the magnitude of this undertaking, consider that the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. stands 288 feet above the ground. However, some of that is a 60-foot Statue of Freedom and her pedestal. When placed alongside each other, the domes of these two buildings are of similar height. Unfortunately, the work came to a halt during the summer of 1836 as Rathbun's financial empire collapsed in a tangled web of paper assets, fraud, and forgery. The courthouse sat at the site of the present-day Central Library. It was built in 1816, and by 1836, columns had been added to give it a more dignified appearance. The building to the rear is the jail. It was pure irony that Rathbun was held in a jail that he himself had built 2 years earlier. The large building with the dome is Rathbun's New American Hotel. It's claimed that Rathbun could hear the grand opening celebration from his prison 2 blocks away. The Eagle Theater was considered unsurpassed by any theater in the United States. It had 4 tiers of balconies and made its own gas for lighting. The Darrow Block was a good example of Buffalo's high-end apartment buildings. All these buildings, and a few others as shown, had been designed and constructed by Rathbun. The wealth generated by Buffalo's unique economy was being reflected by the large estates that were scattered around the city. Far up Main Street was the Goodrich estate, while at Main and Tupper was the Townsend mansion. On Delaware was the unique Johnson Cottage, and down at Niagara Square was a bouquet of abodes, such as the Barton House, Sizer, Austin, and Wilkerson Mansion. On the other side of town was the Bennett Estate and the mansions on Swan Street. Buffalo in the spring of 1836 basked in the sunshine of total optimism. But a storm was approaching that would shatter dreams and bring financial ruin to many. When Benjamin Rathbun was arrested in August of 1836 on charges of fraud and forgery, his empire imploded with the suddenness of a soap bubble. The whole city came to a halt as leading citizens tried to discern reality from the paper web of worthless bonds and loans. Even more woe was in store for the city, for following on this devastating tempest was the National Depression of 1837. It would be years before Buffalo was entangled from the Rathbun fiasco and could resume her fair weather climb to prosperity.